checks and balances, broadly understood, might restrain a president from abusing his power. The results were not encouraging. The games demonstrated repeatedly that an authoritarian in control of the executive branch with little concern for legal limits holds a structural advantage over any lawful effort to restrain him. His message, quote, "The pro-democracy coalition cannot afford to splinter." In 2017, with no advance warning, opposition to Trump's authoritarian policies coalesced quickly. If ahead of 2025, rule of law advocates take time to prepare, the coalition could work even more closely for the common defense. Gelman's is an urgent warning, as Trump has already broadcast his efforts to undermine our election systems, including this weekend's shout out to Georgia State Election Board members who are trying to change the state's election rules.
I don't know if you've heard, but the Georgia State Election Board is in a very positive way. This is a very positive thing, Marjorie. They're on fire. They're doing a great job. 3 members, Janice Johnson, Rick Jeffries, and Janelle King. 3 people are all pit bulls fighting for honesty, transparency, and victory. They're fighting.
And you got to ask at this point, fighting for what? No one's voted there, and Georgia was first to pass a election integrity law. It's where we start the hour with some of our favorite experts and friends. Brennan Center for Justice Senior Advisor, the aforementioned Barton Gelman, is here. Also joining us, Professor of History at NYU, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, and Media Matters President Angela Carasone is back with us. An all-star group assembled. Bart, I start with you. I like to always remind everyone that you wrote sort of the first "the lights were flashing red" article ahead of the election, coming as close as any human being to predicting the mayhem that Trump would sow ahead of his defeat. And I wonder if you can just, with sort of that lens around it, tell us how you see this effort to seed local election boards with election deniers, who Trump is already shouting out from the podium.
Yeah, well, that was part of Trump's 2020 plan that I wrote about in September before that election. It sort of reminds you of the old Stalinist expression that it doesn't matter who votes for you. What matters is who counts the vote. And the election board in Georgia is trying to give itself the power not to certify the results even after they are counted again, audited, and so forth. They can still have the discretion to decide that the vote count is wrong and that the state's electors should be awarded to the losing candidate. I mean, it's just profoundly anti-democratic. And my colleagues at the Brennan Center are doing a lot of good work to try to protect the integrity of the vote.
Tell me what that looks like, and tell me if you and your colleagues feel like we're paying adequate attention to this part of it. I don't even want to call it Trump's campaign. It's not a campaign. It's sort of a framework to cheat, to rig the results.
Yeah, it's actually kind of the anti-campaign. It's the antidote to voters who vote for your opponent, is to disqualify. So, every one of your viewers, because you've talked about this so many times, is familiar with the many ways of trying to suppress the vote. Part of it is purging them from the voter rolls so that they don't get to vote to begin with, and then there's challenging them at the polls, trying to object to letting them vote at the polls, and then the ultimate thing is to pretend they haven't voted as they have. It's to mess around with the count. And I don't know what to say. I mean, democracy depends on certain basic things, like when you count the votes, you go sort of start from 1, keep going up by increments, and let arithmetic do the job. You just can't give people discretion to ignore the arithmetic.
And I want to sort of put this under the Klieg lights because that's exactly what Trump is doing. Let me show you, Ruth, what he's had to say about not needing to do what Bart just said, not needing votes.
My instruction, we don't need the votes. I have so many votes.
We don't need votes. I tell my people, I don't need any votes. We got all the votes we need. I don't need votes. We don't need votes. We got more votes than anybody's ever had. You don't have to vote. Don't worry about voting. The voting, we got plenty of votes.
So, Ruth, my question isn't, what's he saying, what's he doing? My question is, what do the rest of us do who want what Bart just talked about, to continue to live in a democracy?
I think it's all the more important that we get a huge turnout to vote because, when Trump was talking about not needing to vote, what strikes me often as in his message to Christians is that he's presenting voting as a burden that he will be only too happy to relieve them of. And that's how dictators talk. And, what you started with, where Republicans are speaking out in favor of Harris, is so important because this is not an election about policy. This is a referendum on what political system we're going to have. Is it going to be autocracy or democracy? And it's really striking that Trump is, coming out, as he always has, but much more emphatically about what side he's on. And, those who talk about, like, they absorb his messages against the radical left inside America as the internal enemy. We could come to them if we want to talk to Republicans and say, Trump is not only praising far-right leaders like Putin and Orban, he's praising communist dictators like Xi Jinping for ruling with a, quote, iron fist, and most recently Maduro in Venezuela, who he comes out. And so it's not even about right or left. What Trump cares about is that, people have deprived, these leaders have deprived their people of freedom, and they've maneuvered themselves into positions of absolute power. That's what he wants. So whether it's right or left no longer matters to him. It's all about autocracy.
And I guess, Angela, airing it is another piece of his weakness. I mean, Eddie Glaude in the last hour described him as a political figure who's shriveling under the sharp prosecution of a former prosecutor as his current opponent in Kamala Harris. And I wonder if these tactics start to look less appealing to part of the coalition, at least he thinks he can rely on in November. I want to show you how my colleague Rachel Maddow describes these tactics.
Telling voters, do not bother to vote for me. It doesn't matter if you do. I don't need your votes. That is a thing that should prick up your ears. Because what that means is that he doesn't think he needs to win the vote to win the election. He doesn't think he needs to win the election in order to take power. He thinks something other than votes is going to determine whether or not he gets back in the White House. The Republicans are counting on the election results not being certified, thereby creating chaos in Washington around the results. Just like 2020, right? Just like January 6, 2021, except this time with no Mike Pence in the way and with Republican officials already in place in multiple states saying, yeah, you may not get any sort of official vote.
So Rachel Maddow does a lot of really important things on her program. That's why it is the Rachel Maddow Show. This warning, I think we could play that every single day, and it wouldn't be enough amplification of this warning, right? Not just to the Democrats, but to the country. This is the Trump plan.
Yeah, and there's a lot happening that reinforces that assessment that Rachel Maddow gave. Like, so, for example, in Georgia, one of the biggest stories that was being pushed over the last 5 days, not just in right-wing media, but then even places online, even by Elon Musk himself, was a sort of one of these like Project Veritas like sort of sting operations, which did some, one of their fake investigations in Georgia that claims that at least 14% of non-citizens are voting, which would amount to about 40,000 votes, which is way less votes than Trump, that would have turned the election for Trump in the last cycle. And that's happening all across the country. So one is that they're feeding and putting fuel on this fire, that the vote is going to be stolen in some way, that there are all these examples and all these instances of it. So they're laying the scaffolding for the misinformation and for the narrative that the election was stolen. Last cycle, it was sort of a thing that came together This time, it's an actual backup plan. They're putting in place not just the players and the operatives, as you noted, but then they're also building the narrative. And what's scarier is that the antidote, one of the important antidotes to it, which would be other Republican leaders, have actually all bought into it. So the by and large Republican Party orthodoxy now is that, of course, we'll accept their election results if there's no malfeasance, but they're already preparing and planning to sort of lay the groundwork there. And I think that's the part that's most concerning to me, is that in addition to sort of all the little examples that we see, they've already put in place a lot of the pieces. This is just like the stuff that we talked about with Project 2025, is that this time around, there's a lot more intentionality and deliberate planning. And just one last piece on the voting part that's concerning. We're at the end game here, the end stage. One of the things that's been happening over the past couple of years is right-wing media and right-wing extremists have been attacking local election officials all across the country, so that basically many of them either quit or they leave or they just get cowed into submission. And that's the part that's concerning, is that they've evacuated and pushed out a lot of people that they've then replaced with their own. And part of the strategy that Trump has this cycle is to lean into what he did last time, which is to organize power on what used to be considered the fringes. And the more extremists you bring into the fold, the more violent and more risky and more scarier the tactics that they would be willing to deploy in order to succeed become. Because ultimately, they were on the fringes for a reason, and now they're no longer there.
So, Bart, you sat down and sort of gamed out how to harden ourselves and our democracy against tactics like these, authoritarian tactics. Let me read from your piece. Quote, the most pressing legal question raised in our games was what to do if an authoritarian president defied a court order. Nobody had a good answer, but the rule of law demands one. Democratic self-defense may rest, in the end, on the demonstrated will of the American people, expressed if necessary in persistent large-scale protests to reject authoritarian rule. It feels like that answer and that solution is also the answer to what to do about the Supreme Court's immunity ruling. It is the distillation, I think, of this Republican effort to elect Kamala Harris. That if you're a Republican and you care about democratic norms and you care about the rule of law and you care about the Constitution and you care about this edict that in America we don't have a king, this is the reason to sort of swing over and in this unprecedented election support Harris. What is sort of the reliance of any of these checks holding against Trump's authoritarian impulses of having sort of bipartisan agreement that democracy is worth saving?
Well, we all have to hope that there will be sufficient bipartisan agreement that democracy is essential, that the rule of law, that our constitutional system is worth defending. We don't have as much of that as we would like to have right now. I need to mention here that the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan organization. The role-playing games that we organized in May and June were nonpartisan. There were Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals, about 175 former senior government officials. And our question was, if an authoritarian is elected, how do you defend the Constitution? How do you defend the rule of law? And it turns out to be difficult. And you can't stop everything an authoritarian would do if armed with control over the executive branch, but you can do a lot of